Imagine digging into the earth and you find this sleek, modern smartphone. You document it, note the depth, and you keep digging.
Right, doing standard archaeology.
Exactly. But then you move into the younger, more recent dirt layers, the ones closer to the surface, and you find like a bulky, heavy 1980s rotary telephone.
Which makes absolutely no chronological sense.
None at all. But that backwards timeline is, well, it's exactly what happened with human fossils in Australia.
It really is.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today, our mission for you is to unpack a 150-year-old conundrum that, frankly, completely flipped our expectations of human evolution upside down.
It definitely broke a few paradigms, yeah.
Oh, for sure. We've got a massive stack of archaeological reports, genomic studies, and paleoanthropological papers today. And we are zeroing in on a biological mystery of early human remains known as the robust and the Gracile.
Right. And, to really grasp why this backward step in the timeline was such a massive headache for scientists, we have to look at the world these early people actually inhabited.
So set the scene for us.
Okay, so we are going way back to the Pleistocene epoch. During this time, global sea levels were sometimes up to 120 meters lower than they are today.
Wow. 120 meters.
Yeah, because immense volumes of water were just locked up in these massive continental ice sheets. And that drop in sea level exposed a vast continental shelf. It literally unified mainland Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea into a single massive landmass.
Which we call Sahul, right?
Exactly, Sahul.
Okay, let's unpack this, because getting to Sahul was not like taking a casual stroll across some dried-up land bridge. You still had to navigate the Wallaceian archipelago.
Yeah, that is a really crucial geographic hurdle. Wallacea is this island region separated by incredibly deep ocean trenches. And those trenches, they never dried up, even during the absolute peak of the Ice Age.
So they acted like a wall.
A permanent biological wall between Asian and Australian animal species. For humans to cross it, they had to undertake these deliberate open ocean voyages of 90 to 100 kilometers.
Which requires serious intent. You need planning, you need boat building technology.
You don't just float across that on a log by accident.
Right. But the exact timeline of when people actually made that monumental crossing that's sparking a massive debate right now among researchers.
It's heavily debated. On one side, we have an incredible archaeological site in northern Australia called Madjedbebe.
And they found some wild stuff there.
Oh, yeah. Excavators uncovered edge-ground hatchets, complex grindstones for processing seeds, and even mica pigments that date back an astonishing 65,000 years.
65,000.
Right. It strongly suggests humans were thriving there very, very early on. But on the flip side, some recent genomic studies look closely at the timeline of when modern humans interbred with Neanderthals in Eurasia.
Okay. How does that connect?
Well, based on mutation rates, those geneticists argue that humans mathematically couldn't have reached Sahul until around 50,000 years ago.
So we've got a 15,000-year discrepancy.
Yeah. Both camps have really compelling data. And that tension between the physical artifacts in the ground and the genetic timelines, it remains unresolved.
Okay, but whichever date you lean toward for their arrival, that debate is honestly just the prologue to our main focus today. Because once people were established across Australia, the fossil record they left behind reveals two incredibly distinct physical types of early humans.
Distinct is an understatement.
It's a puzzle that makes absolutely no sense chronologically. And to understand why it's so backwards, we first have to look at the older group, the Gracile pioneers.
Right. For that, we need to travel to the Willandra Lakes region of New South Wales, specifically a site called Lake Mungo.
Which is pretty dry today, right?
Yeah, if you visit now, you'll see this stark, dry landscape of sweeping sand dunes called lunettes. But back in the Pleistocene, it was a thriving, lush, overflowing lake system, just full of fish and water birds, bordered by eucalyptus trees.
So cut to 1968. A geologist named Jim Bowler is surveying this area, and he spots some bones eroding straight out of a dune.
Just sticking out of the sand.
Literally. He brought in archaeologists, and they discovered what we now call Mungo Lady. And then a few years later, in 1974, Bowler and his team found Mungo Man nearby.
And the thing to know about them is, physically, they look totally familiar to us.
Right, they didn't look like cavemen.
Not at all. They're classified as Gracile, meaning they were tall, Slender, lightly built. They had thin cranial bones, high rounded foreheads, and really delicate facial features.
Well, if you put them in modern clothes, they'd just blend in.
Exactly. Morphologically, they look remarkably like anatomically modern humans you would see walking down the street today.
And they weren't just physically modern either. The cultural complexity these two individuals represent is just breathtaking.
It really is.
Mungo Lady is actually the world's oldest known cremation. And it wasn't just like a basic campfire. Her bones were burned, then systematically and physically crushed, and then burned a second time before being buried in a specialized pit.
It's a very deliberate, complex ritual. And Mungo Man's burial was equally profound. He was placed on his back, hands carefully crossed in his lap, and his body was liberally sprinkled with a vibrant red ochre.
And the crazy part about the ochre is where it came from.
Right. The ochre itself was sourced from hundreds of kilometers away from the burial site.
Which implies what, exactly?
Well, it strongly implies the existence of extensive established trade networks, or at least deeply ingrained seasonal migration patterns that span vast territories.
Wow. And the age of these remains is the crucial data point for you, the listener, to really hold on to here. After years of advanced testing, scientific consensus dates Mungo Lady and Mungo Man to between 40,000 and 42,000 years old.
Which is incredibly early for that level of ritual.
Over 40 millennia ago.
Mm-hmm.
You have highly modern Gracile humans practicing intense, complex spiritual rituals.
So keep that in mind. 40,000 years ago, we have sleek, modern-looking people. Because if you find a 40,000-year-old population that looks modern, standard evolutionary logic dictates that the populations coming after them chronologically should look just as modern, right?
Or even more refined.
Exactly.
Which brings us right back to our smartphone and rotary telephone analogy. We found the smartphone at 40,000 years. Now we dig into younger dirt layers and suddenly, bam, we hit the heavy rotary phones.
Robust discoveries.
Right. And these didn't just happen once, they popped up all over the continent.
The initial shockwave actually hit way back in 1886. A contractor found the Talgai skull in southern Queensland, and it was just covered in this thick, heavy incrustation of calcium carbonate.
And then there were more.
Yeah, later came the Kohuna skull. But the watershed moment, the one that truly divided the scientific community, happened in 1967.
Alan Thorne.
Yes. Physical anthropologist Alan Thorne was examining museum drawers in Victoria. He recognized these heavily mineralized, incredibly archaic-looking bones. He traced them back to a swampy site called Cow Swamp, which eventually yielded the remains of over 40 individuals.
And way over on the other side of the continent, in Western Australia, there was another massive find called the Cossack skull. And let's be clear, these individuals look absolutely nothing like the sleek Mungo people.
Nothing like them. They were massively built. We were talking about cranial bone up to 1.3 centimeters thick.
That is absurdly thick for a human skull.
It is. They featured huge projecting faces, heavy prominent brow ridges, and flat, heavily sloping foreheads. From a top-down view, some of these skulls looked almost like a flask because of a distinct pinching inward curvature behind the eye sockets.
I've seen pictures of the Cossack skull. It's wild.
Yeah, the Cossack skull is one of the most extreme examples of an elongated, narrow head shape, what anthropologists called dolichocephalic, ever recorded in Australia.
So if you were looking at these cow swamp skulls, you'd swear you were looking at a primitive, ancient ancestor of the Mungo people. You'd assume, oh, they have to be 60,000 or 80,000 years old.
Naturally.
But here's the timeline twist that completely broke everyone's brain. They are way younger. The cow swamp remains date to just 9,000 to 13,000 years ago.
And the Cossack skull, only about 6,500 years old.
It makes no sense.
It raises a really important question, right? How do you explain a population developing features that look tens of thousands of years more primitive, long after a highly modern population was already established on the exact same landscape?
So how did the scientific community in the 1970s even process this? It seems like it would completely derail everything they thought they knew about human origins.
Well, it created a massive void in understanding. And Alan Thorne stepped right into that void with a highly controversial theory known as the dihybrid model.
Dihybrid, so meaning two.
Yes. Looking at the stark physical differences, he argued there was no way these two groups evolved from the same immediate ancestors. He proposed two entirely separate, distinct migrations into Australia.
Meaning the Gracile people and the robust people came from totally different genetic lineages.
That was his claim. Thorne suggested the Gracile Mungo people descended from a modern human population that originated in Pleistocene China. The robust humans, however, carried what he very dramatically called the mark of ancient Java.
The mark of ancient Java. That sounds like an Indiana Jones movie.
It really does. He theorized they descended from a completely different, non-modern group in Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesian Homo erectus, like the famous Solo man fossils found in Nangong.
Wait, so Thorne is suggesting that an ancient, pre-modern human species survived in Indonesia, eventually figured out how to cross the deep waters of Wallachia, and then lived alongside, or eventually merged with, modern humans in Australia.
That was the assertion, yeah. And this idea became a major pillar for a global debate about human origins. It fueled what's known as the multi-regional model of human evolution.
Remind me, what did the multi-regionalists believe?
They argued that humans didn't just evolve once in Africa and then spread out to replace older species. Instead, they believed our ancestors spread out globally as Homo erectus and then evolved into modern humans in different regions simultaneously, linked only by occasional gene flow.
I mean, that is a massive evolutionary leap to make, based primarily on some thick skulls found in a swamp.
It was heavily debated, for sure. But for multi-regionalists, the robust traits at Cow Swamp were the ultimate evidentiary prize. They saw those heavy brow ridges and sloping foreheads as a direct, surviving evolutionary bridge linking ancient Homo erectus to modern populations.
So they claimed it proved archaic features survived in geographic isolation in Australia until just a few thousand years ago.
Exactly.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting, folks. Because the science didn't just freeze in the 1970s. Modern researchers eventually re-examined those exact same bones and completely dismantled Thorne's entire dihybrid theory.
It was a monumental paradigm shift, really, spearheaded by researchers like Darren Curnow and Peter Brown. They looked at the robust skulls, but attacked the fundamental underlying assumption of the multi-regional theory.
And what was that flaw?
The critical flaw in Thorne's logic was a biological concept known as character atomization.
Wait, atomization? You're kind of losing me there. Are we talking about breaking the skull down to a microscopic or molecular level?
Oh, no, not at all. Older physical anthropology assumed that every individual feature on a skull, like a prominent brow ridge or a sloping forehead or a thick jaw, was a distinct, independent genetic trait passed down directly from an ancestor.
Okay.
It treated the skull almost like a bucket of separate Lego blocks. The assumption was, if you have the heavy brow ridge Lego block, you must have inherited it directly from a Homo erectus ancestor who carried that exact same block in their DNA.
Oh, okay. I think I see what you mean. Let me try to translate this. It's like looking at a vehicle and judging where it was manufactured solely by looking at its tires.
Right. Go on.
If you see a truck with massive, rugged off-road mud tires, you wouldn't automatically assume it was built in some primitive tractor factory, while a car with smooth street tires was built in a sleek, modern sports car factory.
That is the perfect way to visualize it.
Right, because it just means the truck was adapted for a rugged off-road environment after it rolled off the assembly line. You can't separate the mud tires from the vehicle's ultimate purpose. And with these ancient humans, you can't just isolate a heavy brow ridge from the way the entire head was living, growing, and functioning in its environment.
Beautifully put. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at ontogeny and phenotypic plasticity. Yeah, ontogeny is the process of how an organism develops over its individual lifetime. The skull is not a rigid blueprint that prints out perfectly the same way every time. It is a highly integrated, dynamic, living organ. Its final shape is dictated by developmental forces and environmental pressures, not just the DNA you inherited at conception.
So the skull actually changes shape as you live your life.
Constantly. For example, a flat, receding forehead isn't automatically a Homo erectus gene. In anatomically modern humans, the shape of the cranial vault is largely determined by the growing brain interacting with the base of the skull during childhood.
Okay, so the brain pushes against the bone.
Right. If you have a large modern brain but a relatively narrow skull base, the brain is forced to grow posteriorly backward. That mechanical growth naturally pulls the forehead into a flatter slope, and the bone might even create a larger brow ridge just to structurally support the face and eyes. It is developmental mechanics, not an ancient genetic ghost.
Wow. But hold on a second. The physical differences between the Cow Swamp people and the Mungo people are still real. I mean, you can see them.
Oh, they're very real.
So if it wasn't ancient Homo erectus DNA giving the Cow Swamp and Kahuna people those robust archaic features, what on earth caused it?
The answers lie in this really powerful combination of culture and environment. Let's look at culture first. Specifically, the practice of artificial cranial modification.
You mean head binding? Like deliberately altering an infant's head shape?
Precisely. Anthropologist Peter Brown conducted a brilliant comparative study to test this exact theory. He took the robust Australian skull, specifically from Kahuna, and a very prominent skull known as Cow Swamp 5, and compared them with deliberately artificially deformed Araw skulls from New Britain in Melanesia.
And the Araw culture famously practiced infant head pressing for aesthetic and cultural reasons, right?
Yes, exactly.
And what were the results of that comparison?
They were undeniable. Brown's analysis proved beyond any dispute that the extreme sloping foreheads on some of these robust Australian skulls matched the exact morphological changes produced by deliberate human deformation.
Oh.
Yeah. They weren't born looking like that. They were shaped that way by the hands of their parents. And Cow Swamp 5, dating to roughly 13,000 years ago, represents the oldest known example of this practice anywhere in the world.
That is incredible. A cultural beauty standard literally tricked the eye of modern scientists.
It really did.
But, head binding only explains the shape of the forehead. What about the sheer thickness of the bone? I mean, a 1.3 centimeter thick skull vault and massive jutting jaws that can't be explained by tying a bandage around a baby's head.
You're absolutely right. To understand the immense bone thickness, we have to look at their diet and a fundamental biological rule called Wolff's Law.
Wolff's Law, what does that state?
Wolff's Law states that bone in a healthy person will adapt to the mechanical loads under which it is placed.
So if you stress the bone, it builds itself up to get stronger.
Yes. And the cow swamp individuals had an incredibly stressful diet. They were living an arid hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and a huge staple of their caloric intake was seeds, which they ground using stones.
Uh-oh. Scone ground seeds. That sounds gritty.
Very. When you grind food with stones, fine sand and grit inevitably get mixed into the meal. Over a lifetime, chewing that grit acts like heavy sandpaper. Their teeth were an absolute disaster.
I can't even imagine.
They were worn down halfway to the roots, exposing the soft pulp and causing chronic, severe periodontal disease.
Okay, that sounds excruciating.
Mm-hmm.
But how does chewing grit translate to a thicker skull vault?
Well, they weren't just eating grit. They were frequently using their teeth as a third hand, stripping tough bark, holding items, softening dried sinew.
Ah, so pulling and tearing.
Exactly. All of this required massive, powerful jaw muscles, and those muscles anchored directly to the skull. Every time they bit down with incredible force, it placed tremendous mechanical stress on the skull bones.
And because of Wolff's Law.
Under Wolff's Law, specialized cells called osteoblasts respond to that intense stress by laying down more bone tissue. It reinforces the structure to prevent microfractures.
So they essentially chewed their way to a thicker skull.
In a biological sense, yeah. The robust face, the extremely thick cranial vault, these were biomechanical responses to the sheer physical force required by their arid lifestyle. The heavy brow ridges basically acted as biological shock absorbers to dissipate the intense mechanical stress of constant heavy chewing.
Wow. So what does this all mean for us? When we step back from this 150-year-old conundrum, it feels like the pieces finally fit together. The genomic evidence we have today gives us a definitive answer. There was only a single founding population that settled Sahul.
Right. Though to be completely accurate with the genomics, those studies do show that as these modern humans migrated through Asia toward Australia, they interbred with an extinct group of ancient hominins called Denisovans.
Oh, right, the Denisovans.
Yeah, so they did carry a small percentage of Denisovan DNA with them. But the key takeaway that completely shattered Thorne's model is that there were no two separate species.
Oh, right.
There are no separate migrations of Gracile people and robust Homo erectus people into Australia.
It's all one family tree.
It is. The dramatic physical differences we see in these ancient Australian remains are actually a profound testament to the incredible adaptability of Homo sapiens.
That phenotypic plasticity we talked about.
Exactly. It shows us that our skeletons aren't static rock. They respond deeply to our environment, to cultural practices like head pressing, and to the sheer mechanical forces of our daily survival and diet.
Phenotypic plasticity in action. Our bodies are essentially clay, continuously molded by how we live. Which brings up something really fascinating for you, the listener, to think about as we wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a fun thought experiment.
We started by expecting the fossil record to be a neat, tidy progression, like a visible medical X-ray of evolution. But we found out it's messy, deceptive, and entirely shaped by culture and environment.
Which raises a pretty important question about our future fossil record.
Exactly. Because if the very shape of human skulls can be so dramatically altered by local diets and cultural beauty practices in just a single lifetime, I mean, altered enough to literally trick brilliant scientists into thinking they had discovered a completely different ancient species. How will future archaeologists misinterpret the physical remnants of our modern lifestyles?
It's a great point.
With our text necks from staring down at our phones for decades, our altered, shrinking jawlines from eating highly processed, soft foods, the sheer lack of mechanical stress on our bones. What bone-deep changes are we creating today without even realizing it?
Seriously, when they dig us up 40,000 years from now, it makes you wonder what kind of evolutionary missing link they might mistake us for.
Definitely something I'm all over. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.